The North Atlantic, 1942. The ocean is restless, black waves glinting under a cold moon. Somewhere below, a German U-boat stalks its prey. Its commander feels untouchable. The Wolfpack has ruled these waters for years. And when his lookouts first spotted America's newest torpedo bomber, they burst out laughing. The TBF Avenger. Too big, too slow, a flying truck that had no place in the deadly chess match of the Atlantic. Compared to the sleek Luftwaffe machines, this lumbering beast looked like a farm wagon strapped with wings. A joke, they thought, and jokes don't win wars. But in war, laughter often becomes the prelude to silence. The Avenger, mocked for its bulk, was built for patience. It could loiter for hours, sweep vast stretches of ocean, and drop weapons precisely where U-boats least expected them. On that night, as the submarine surfaced to strike a convoy, the sky erupted with the growl of a Wright R-2600 engine. The flying truck dove from the clouds, its bomb bay yawning open. Depth charges splashed into the water, seconds ticking like a funeral drum. Then, the sea exploded. The U-boat, once the hunter, was torn apart, swallowed whole by the abyss it once ruled. This is not just a story about a plane and a submarine. It is about arrogance, about underestimation, and about how technology dismissed as laughable can turn into a predator that rewrites strategy. The TBF Avenger did not need to be graceful, it needed to be relentless. And relentless it was, until the German Navy learned the hard way that their laughter had a terrible echo at the bottom of the sea. And that is why you are here. Because history speaks in ironies, and the lessons of arrogance echo into our own time. If you want to uncover more stories like this, where forgotten machines reshape wars and pride turns into tragedy, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and join our growing community of history enthusiasts who refuse to let these lessons fade. The past is alive, the stories are raw, and each one reminds us, never scoff at what you don't yet understand. The Avenger proved it in 1942. And tonight, we bring that story to life. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a war of glory. It was a war of attrition, steel convoys against steel predators, supply lines stretched across stormy seas, and a struggle where victory meant survival itself. By 1941, the Kriegsmarine's U-boats had become the terror of the Atlantic. Entire convoys vanished, merchant ships burned, and Allied sailors lived in constant fear of torpedoes slicing silently through the waves at night. The statistics told a grim story. In 1942 alone, the so-called Second Happy Time for the German Navy, U-boats sank more than 600 Allied ships, over 3 million tons of cargo. Britain, reliant on imported food, oil, and arms, teetered on the edge of collapse. Each U-boat was not just a submarine, it was a knife aimed at the throat of the Allied war effort. Against this menace, the Allies scrambled for solutions. They deployed destroyers, corvettes, depth charges, sonar, and patrol aircraft. Yet none seemed sufficient. Long stretches of the Atlantic remained air gaps, zones where no Allied aircraft could patrol. Here, U-boats hunted freely, surfacing by night to recharge batteries and strike with impunity. It was in this desperate moment that a new aircraft entered the fray, the TBF Avenger. To the Germans, it was a laughable sight. The Avenger was massive compared to carrier aircraft of its day. With a 54-foot wingspan and a weight exceeding 10 tons when loaded, it dwarfed earlier planes like the Douglas TBD Devastator. Its very size became the subject of jokes among Luftwaffe pilots and U-boat crews. German intelligence reports dismissed it as too large to be effective, a lumbering cow that would be easy prey if it ever dared to venture near contested waters. The mockery was not entirely baseless. Early Avengers were plagued with problems. Their engines overheated, maintenance was difficult aboard cramped escort carriers, and pilots often complained of sluggish handling. To men used to the nimble fighters of the Eastern Front, the Avenger appeared to be the wrong tool for a deadly job. "This is supposed to stop our wolfpacks?" One U-boat officer scoffed, according to Allied intelligence intercepts. To him, the idea that such a machine could stalk submarines across the Atlantic was absurd. But what the Germans mocked, the Americans quietly perfected. The Avenger was not designed for beauty. It was designed for persistence. With a range exceeding 1,000 miles, it could patrol the once unguarded mid-Atlantic. Its bomb bay could carry not just torpedoes, but depth charges and, later, sophisticated homing torpedoes. Crews learned to coordinate with radar-equipped escort carriers, using primitive but effective airborne search radars to spot submarines even at night. Here was the irony. The very bulk that Germans mocked gave the Avenger room for equipment smaller planes could never carry. Radar sets, additional fuel tanks, sonobuoys, all could fit inside its fuselage. And its defensive armament, 3.50 caliber machine guns and a .30 caliber belly gun, made it far from defenseless. When supported by carriers, Avengers became relentless predators, circling convoys like guardian hawks. By 1943, the laughter began to fade. U-boat losses mounted. The once proud wolfpacks were being hunted, not hunting. Yet in the early years, arrogance blinded German command. Karl Donitz, the architect of U-boat strategy, remained convinced that submarines could evade aircraft by diving quickly. He underestimated how rapidly Avengers could appear on scene, how effectively they could coordinate with surface escorts, and how their depth charges had evolved into precise killers. The problem was not just technical. It was psychological. For too long, the German Navy believed in the invulnerability of the U-boat. They saw themselves as hunters, not prey. To acknowledge the Avenger as a threat meant admitting vulnerability. So they continued to laugh, right up until the moment an Avenger's shadow passed overhead, bomb bay doors opening. This is the paradox of the background. On one side stood the most effective submarine fleet in history, a force that nearly starved Britain into submission. On the other, a machine mocked as ungainly, an afterthought of American industry. Yet history is merciless to arrogance. The very flying truck became the weapon that closed the air gap, broke the U-boat's dominance, and ensured the convoy survived. The problem for Germany was not just that the Avenger existed, it was that they refused to take it seriously until it was too late. By the time the lessons were learned, by the time countermeasures were devised, the tide had already turned. U-boats that once roamed freely now dived in panic at the faintest sound of aircraft engines. Their laughter had drowned in the same depths where their steel coffins sank. And so the stage was set. The background of arrogance met the problem of persistence. The German Navy scoffed at the Avenger. Soon enough, their U-boats would become its feast. The German Navy's greatest mistake was not only technical but psychological. By ridiculing the TBF Avenger as a slow-flying truck, they underestimated the very qualities that made it lethal: range, payload, and persistence. That arrogance delayed countermeasures, allowing the Allies to close the Atlantic air gap and turn the hunter into the hunted. What began as a joke in 1942 ended as a catastrophe beneath the waves. When the TBF Avenger rolled out onto the decks of American carriers in 1942, even its own crews sometimes whispered that it looked more like a flying barn than a warplane. To the eyes of German naval officers and U-boat commanders, this lumbering shape only confirmed their contempt. Compared to the sharp, swift outlines of fighters or the sleek menace of dive bombers, the Avenger seemed clumsy, overweight, and utterly unsuited for the ruthless, fluid war being fought beneath the waves. What they failed to grasp was that war in the Atlantic was not about elegance or grace. It was about endurance, reach, and relentless pressure, and in those categories the Avenger was designed to excel. At its heart was the Wright R-2600 twin Cyclone, a 14-cylinder radial engine that produced around 1,700 horsepower. On paper, that power translated into a maximum speed of roughly 275 miles per hour, hardly impressive compared to frontline fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 or even patrol planes like the Focke-Wulf Condor. Yet this very metric, which German officers scoffed at, was a red herring. Speed mattered in a dogfight, not in the grim chess match between submarines and convoy escorts. The Atlantic did not reward bursts of speed. It rewarded those who could stay airborne for hours, sweeping mile after mile of gray sea, patiently waiting for the telltale ripple of a periscope or the faint radar return of a surfaced submarine. In that contest, the Avenger was not weak, it was lethal. Fully fueled, the Avenger could patrol for more than 1,000 miles, and with auxiliary tanks, even farther. It could loiter over convoys, circling for hours while its crew scanned the ocean below, a constant eye in the sky that gave U-boat captains nightmares. The Germans' pride, the Type 7 submarine, could dash across the surface at 17 knots and crawl underwater at barely 7. Against such quarry, an aircraft did not need to be swift, it needed to be watchful, persistent, and armed with the right tools. The Avenger was all of these, and more. Its cavernous bomb bay gave it a versatility that smaller aircraft could never match. It could deliver the cumbersome Mark 13 aerial torpedo, capable of crippling even the largest enemy ships, or switch to bombs and depth charges for hunting submarines. As the war progressed, the Avenger became the delivery platform for one of the most advanced weapons of the age, the Fido acoustic homing torpedo. Once dropped, Fido tracked the very sound of a submarine's propellers, following them into the depths with unnerving persistence. Imagine being a German U-boat commander in 1944, diving desperately as an Avenger roared overhead, only to know that somewhere in the darkness a machine was literally listening for you, chasing you, and there was no maneuver clever enough to shake it. The flying truck, that had been mocked from the start, was now wielding guided death beneath the waves. But weapons alone cannot explain why the Avenger transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. Its true genius lay in how its bulk allowed it to become a flying laboratory of new technology. Smaller aircraft could only carry fuel and bombs. The Avenger carried fuel, bombs, radar, and more. The air-to-surface vessel radar sets mounted aboard Avengers gave them the ability to detect submarines on the surface even in the middle of the night or in weather so foul that no human lookout could see. For years, U-boats had relied on darkness to cloak their surfacing, timing battery recharges for moonless nights. Suddenly, those nights became the most dangerous time of all. An Avenger, circling unseen in the black sky, could catch the faint return of a conning tower on its radar screen, dive without warning, and unleash its depth charges before the submarine had even realized it had been spotted. To this was added the innovation of sonobuoys, small disposable listening devices dropped into the ocean that allowed crews to triangulate a submarine's position. For a U-boat, already hounded by destroyers and corvettes, this meant the very water around them was becoming an enemy, seeded with ears that betrayed their presence. The Avenger's size also made it possible to mount the lee light, a powerful searchlight capable of flooding the night ocean with sudden, blinding illumination. A U-boat captain, thinking he was invisible beneath the stars, would surface, and then find his vessel lit up like a stage, with bombs seconds away. What German officers dismissed as dead weight was in fact the physical space needed to house this suite of tools. Their contempt blinded them to the reality that aviation technology in the Atlantic War was no longer about sleek airframes. It was about integration, about combining fuel, sensors, weapons, and crew endurance into one system. And in this role, the Avenger was not a barn in the sky, but a wolf in farmer's clothing. The Germans, of course, had their own long-range patrol aircraft, the Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condor, which had terrorized convoys early in the war. But unlike the Avenger, the Condor lacked the ability to deliver both sensors and weapons in one package. It could spot a convoy, it could harass it with bombs, but it could not linger overhead for hours with radar sweeping, nor could it launch from the small decks of escort carriers scattered across the Atlantic. That was the quiet revolution the Germans ignored: mobility. The Avenger did not depend on massive land bases in Britain or Iceland alone. It could ride the sea on jeep carriers, small escort carriers that traveled with convoys, bringing with them a miniature air force wherever it was needed. Suddenly, waters once considered safe for U-boats were covered by watchful eyes from the sky, and those eyes could arrive without warning. The tactical interaction between Avenger and U-boat became brutally simple. A submarine sighted a convoy, surfaced to close the distance, and in those minutes exposed itself. The Avenger, cruising on radar patrol, could detect that exposure from miles away. At a speed of 200 miles per hour, it would close in minutes. The U-boat captain might call for an emergency dive, but that maneuver took precious seconds, often half a minute or more for the submarine to fully submerge. In that half-minute, the Avenger's bomb bay doors opened, and depth charges rolled into the sea, their fuses set for the exact depth the U-boat would reach. What had once been the hunter's moment of triumph now became a death sentence delivered from above. Even in defense, the Avenger was no helpless beast. Its .50 caliber Browning machine gun turret could rake attacking aircraft, while additional defensive guns under the belly and in the wings gave it a surprising sting. Luftwaffe condors that tried to prowl near convoys occasionally found themselves driven off or shot down, humiliated by the very machine that the Kriegsmarine had derided. The truck could bite. The true measure of its impact, however, lay in numbers. In 1942, the Atlantic was bleeding Allied tonnage at an unsustainable rate, with U-boats sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. By mid-1943, as Avengers spread across escort carriers and radar technology matured, the tide shifted with brutal clarity. In May of that year alone, forever remembered as Black May, 43 U-boats were lost, many of them to aircraft patrols that included Avengers. What the Germans had laughed at in 1942 had, by 1943, become the reaper that cut down their submarine fleet in droves. There is a particular irony in the physics of the Avenger's supposed weaknesses. Its size, which inspired ridicule, was precisely what allowed it to carry the extended fuel, the heavy radar units, the bomb loads, and the multiple crew members needed to manage them. Its moderate speed, mocked as sluggish, made it a stable bombing platform, capable of steady approaches and accurate drops, something a faster, twitchier aircraft might have fumbled. In every detail, the characteristics that produced derision were the very ones that produced results. If we translate this into a metaphor for modern viewers, imagine two hunters in a vast wilderness. One is quick, light, and armed with a sharp rifle, darting in and out of the forest. The other is slower, burdened with supplies and equipment, trudging steadily along. At first, the faster hunter looks superior, moving with grace. But as the days stretch on, it is the slower hunter, with his food, his binoculars, and his traps, who dominates the hunt. The Avenger was that slower hunter, mocked at first, but inexorable in the long game. By 1944, German commanders no longer laughed when they saw the silhouette of an Avenger banking in the clouds. They dove for cover, radioed frantic warnings, and prayed their batteries were charged enough to buy them time underwater. But prayers did not stop acoustic torpedoes, and cover was often too late against radar eyes. The contempt that once defined their view of the Avenger had curdled into dread, a dread confirmed with each new loss reported back to headquarters. The hunter had become the hunted, and the wolfpacks of the Atlantic were being starved into extinction by the very machine once dismissed as a flying truck. The lesson buried in the metal of the Avenger is as old as warfare itself. Never mistake appearances for reality, and never underestimate a tool simply because it does not fit the image of what you fear. The Germans scoffed at the Avenger, just as the Japanese had scoffed at the B-29, and in both cases, their laughter faded into silence beneath mushroom clouds or beneath black waves. Arrogance blinded them, and technology, patient and unspectacular, rewrote the rules of survival. The year was 1942, and the Atlantic still belonged to the wolfpack. Convoys struggled across the gray waters under constant threat, merchant ships vanishing in blossoms of flame and smoke as torpedoes tore into their hulls. The men of the Kriegsmarine walked with swagger, convinced that their undersea hunters were strangling Britain into submission. In that year, a new plane appeared on the horizon, the TBF Avenger, and the reaction among German officers was scornful. They saw its thick fuselage, its lumbering takeoff, its broad wings folded like awkward limbs on carrier decks, and they laughed. This was no Predator, they told themselves, but a flying truck, too slow to chase, too heavy to maneuver, too ungainly to make a difference. And yet, history is built on the moments when arrogance blinds men to what is truly dangerous. The first operational Avengers began patrols from carriers like USS Long Island and USS Bogue in late 1942, assigned to guard convoys that had long been left vulnerable once they passed beyond land-based air cover. To the U-boat captains, this seemed insignificant. After all, the Atlantic was vast, the sky empty more often than not, and for years their surface attacks at night had been virtually unstoppable. But as 1943 dawned, the pattern shifted. Reports began trickling back to German bases, U-boats forced to crash dive by unexpected aircraft, submarines crippled by sudden bombardments, patrol lines scattered not by destroyers but by an enemy that arrived from the sky. One of the earliest encounters took place in the spring of 1943, when an Avenger from the escort carrier USS Bogue was vectored onto a radar contact in the dead of night. The U-boat, surfacing to recharge its batteries, believed itself hidden by darkness. The Avenger's crew, their eyes fixed on the green glow of radar, descended into the black Atlantic void with precision born of training. At just the right moment, a powerful lee light snapped on, bathing the submarine in a cone of dazzling brilliance. For a few seconds, frozen in the glare, the German sailors stood motionless on deck, their laughter from months before now turned into panic. Depth charges rolled free, splashing into the sea. Moments later, a column of water and fire erupted, and when it fell back, the Atlantic had claimed another victim. For the men who witnessed such strikes, the shift was unmistakable. A British sailor aboard a convoy escort later wrote that when the Avengers arrived, the ocean seemed suddenly smaller, as if their wings had stretched a net across it. What he described was more than sentiment. It was the tactical transformation of the war. The Avengers' range allowed overlapping patrols, the carriers repositioning constantly to cover new ground, until the hunting grounds of the U-boats shrank to narrow corridors filled with danger. By May of 1943, the reckoning had arrived. The month would be remembered as Black May, the moment when the hunters became the hunted. 43 German U-boats were lost in that single month, many to aircraft operating from escort carriers, Avengers among them. For the Kriegsmarine, it was a disaster beyond numbers, for each submarine carried not just its crew but months of training, scarce resources, and the myth of invincibility. The very sight of a dark shape circling in the clouds began to spread dread through the wolfpacks. The planes they had mocked were tearing them apart, one patrol at a time. From the analyst's view, the reason lay in synergy. The Avenger was not alone. It worked in concert with the convoy escorts, radar, and codebreakers who fed them intelligence. But without the endurance and payload of the Avenger, this system would have been a net with holes. The plane's ability to carry radar, sonobuoys, torpedoes, and depth charges all in one frame made it the indispensable predator. U-boat commanders wrote bitterly in their logs about the inescapable eye that found them at night, an eye they could neither outpace nor outfight. The irony is sharp. In 1942, German submariners would mock the ungainly silhouettes of Avengers spotted on the horizon, convinced they could simply dive and disappear. By the summer of 1943, those same men surfaced in fear, scanning the skies, knowing that somewhere up there a flying truck might already be circling, invisible, waiting for them to reveal themselves. Their laughter had died in the cold spray of the Atlantic. What remained was silence, broken only by the roar of radial engines and the thunder of depth charges, reminders that arrogance is often punished not with mercy, but with fire and steel. By 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted irreversibly. The German wolfpacks, once arrogant masters of the sea lanes, were now hounded shadows of their former selves. Their commanders no longer boasted of the tonnage war at officers' mess tables. Instead, they whispered about new Allied weapons, about planes that seemed to appear from nowhere, about a particular machine that dropped death with unnerving precision. The Avenger had matured, and its arrival in the Atlantic now spelled doom for any submarine caught in its sights. The key to this transformation lay in technology carried in its bomb bay and on its racks. Earlier in the war, depth charges required skill, guesswork, and a little luck. A U-boat diving steeply could sometimes escape with bruises, evading the hammer blows long enough to fight another day. But in 1944, the Avengers carried something altogether different: the Fido acoustic torpedo. Officially known as the Mark 24 mine to disguise its purpose, this weapon was the first Allied homing torpedo, designed to listen for the noise of a submarine's propellers and chase it relentlessly beneath the waves. Once dropped, it circled and hunted with mechanical patience, forcing submarines to maneuver frantically, exhausting batteries, only to meet the inevitable. One U-boat officer, captured after his vessel was destroyed by a Fido launched from an Avenger, admitted that the sound of the torpedo in the water was worse than depth charges. The charges came with thunder, but they ended quickly. The torpedo was a whisper that never stopped, a sound you could not escape. His words capture the psychological shift. The ocean itself had become hostile, as if the very water conspired with the aircraft above. On the tactical level, the Avenger's range and radar meant that it could patrol far into what had once been safe zones. Escort carriers brought these planes directly into the mid-Atlantic gap, the deadly stretch where U-boats once ravaged shipping beyond reach of land-based patrols. Now there was no gap, no safe haven. Avengers could launch in a morning, sweep hundreds of miles of ocean with radar, drop sonobuoys where suspicion lingered, and return to their carriers to refuel while another patrol took their place. The net was constant, unbreakable, and always closing. One battle in the summer of 1944 illustrates this perfectly. A wolfpack, assembled to strike at a heavily laden convoy, was betrayed by its own invisibility. Allied intelligence, reading German signals, vectored Avengers to the area. As dusk fell, the first submarine rose to periscope depth, then surfaced. Within minutes, radar aboard an Avenger lit up with its trace. The plane dived, releasing sonobuoys in a triangle around the contact, then circled above like a vulture. When the submarine finally committed to the surface, hoping to recharge batteries quickly and retreat, the Avenger dropped a Fido. Survivors later reported the eerie minutes that followed, as the torpedo closed in with slow inevitability. There was no evasion, no clever trick to shake it off. The submarine was struck, the hull cracked open, and another hunter sank silently into the graveyard of the Atlantic. The analyst's view shows why this was decisive. The U-boat design had reached its limits by 1944. Submerged endurance was short, and speed underwater was far too slow to escape acoustic tracking. The Germans were working feverishly on new designs, such as the Type XXI, a true submarine capable of prolonged underwater speed. But these would arrive too late, and in too few numbers, to reverse the tide. In the meantime, the Avenger's combination of radar, sonobuoys, lee lights, and acoustic torpedoes meant that every engagement tilted against the U-boats before it even began. Reports from Allied sailors reflect the transformation. One convoy escort officer recalled that the men began to cheer whenever they saw Avengers overhead. "We knew they were the difference between survival and the bottom of the sea. When they circled above us, we felt the U-boats were the ones on borrowed time." To sailors who had once lived in terror of periscopes and torpedo wakes, the Avenger became a symbol of safety, a flying shield that turned convoys from vulnerable prey into protected caravans. Meanwhile, the Germans' laughter had curdled into grim silence. No one joked about the flying truck anymore. Reports reaching Admiral Donitz spoke of losses outpacing production, of crews refusing to sail, of wolfpacks broken apart before they could strike. In Berlin, the High Command clung to promises of new technology, but in the Atlantic, every submarine crew knew the truth. The hunters had become the hunted. What is most striking, looking back, is the cruel irony of it all. The very features that seemed to make the Avenger laughable, its bulk, its slow pace, its awkward lines, were exactly the qualities that gave it the endurance to stay in the air, the space to carry radar and sonobuoys, the stability to deliver accurate drops, and the flexibility to adapt to new weapons like Fido. What began as a sneer in 1942 had become a death sentence in 1944. And in the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic, every plume of water from an exploding submarine testified to the cost of underestimation. By 1945, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the wolfpack. What had once been a vast hunting ground for German submarines was now a graveyard littered with twisted steel, torn hulls, and the silent testimony of thousands of sailors who never returned. The Avenger had played its role with quiet persistence, stripping away the aura of invincibility that the U-boat once carried. Where in 1942 the Germans had mocked the machine as a flying truck, in 1945 they looked skyward with dread whenever its silhouette appeared against the clouds. The final year of the war was not defined by dramatic duels, but by attrition, an attrition that the U-boats could no longer sustain. The Allies had reached a state of overwhelming superiority, with escort carriers dotting the seas, Avengers maintaining patrols in endless rotation, and radar and sonobuoys closing every gap that once allowed submarines to slip away. Each sortie was not a daring gamble, but a routine hunt, and in that routine lay the death of the U-boat fleet. Take, for instance, the winter of 1945, when U-boat crews attempted one last surge into the Atlantic. Many of these submarines were crewed by inexperienced men, hastily trained replacements for veterans already lost. They sailed out under orders, but morale was broken. Logs recovered after captures revealed the despair: "We no longer believe in victory." Each patrol is a sentence carried out by the enemy's aircraft. The enemy's aircraft, most often Avengers, had become the defining terror of their war. In January, a wolfpack attempted to intercept a convoy bound for Britain. Their signals, already compromised by Allied code-breaking, betrayed them before they ever closed in. Avengers were launched, sweeping the ocean where the submarines waited. Radar screens flickered with returns, sonobuoys splashed into the water, and before the first torpedo could ever be fired, 2 U-boats had been forced down and destroyed. Survivors spoke later of the futility, of feeling hunted before they could even draw near to their prey. It was a reversal so absolute that even Donitz himself admitted privately that the Atlantic War was lost. The analysts seized the inevitability of this collapse. By 1945, the Avenger was not a lone machine but part of a perfected system of maritime dominance. Long-range liberators closed the widest gaps, destroyer escorts filled the seas with sonar, and Avengers provided the constant aerial hammer, striking with radar-guided precision and delivering weapons that no submarine could resist. The acoustic torpedoes, the depth charges, the radar sweeps, all were the nails, and the Avenger was the hammer that drove them in. The Germans had innovations on the drawing board, the Type XXI with its faster submerged speed, the snorkel for extended underwater operation, but they arrived too late, and in too few numbers to matter. One haunting episode occurred in the spring of 1945, when an Avenger squadron operating from an escort carrier stumbled upon a lone U-boat attempting to slip back toward Norway. The submarine, already battered from earlier attacks, had surfaced in desperation. The Avenger crews, circling patiently, gave no warning. They attacked in a coordinated run, depth charges falling with mechanical precision, until the sea itself erupted. Sailors on the convoy below watched as oil slicks and debris floated to the surface. There was no cheer, only silence. By then, the outcome was beyond doubt, and what remained was a grim recognition that the war at sea was not a duel anymore but an extermination. Yet even in this extermination, the irony remained sharp. The very attributes that had provoked laughter, the Avenger's size, its deliberate pace, its bulk, were the ones that carried the day. It could stay aloft while smaller planes had to return to base. It could carry the heavy radar sets that revealed submarines in the dark. It could haul the new torpedoes that tracked and killed without mercy. Every detail mocked by German pilots in 1942 had by 1945 become the details written into their obituaries. For the men who flew the Avenger, there was little glory in these final months. They were not fighter aces dueling in the skies, but hunters executing a mission, often against enemies who could barely fight back. One pilot later reflected, "It was not triumph we felt, but inevitability. They laughed at us once, but in the end, they never laughed again." His words serve as both an epitaph for the U-boat fleet and a reminder of the cost of arrogance. By May 1945, the Kriegsmarine had no answer left. Hundreds of submarines surrendered, their crews climbing out of hatches with their hands raised, not to the destroyers around them but to the very aircraft overhead that had driven them to submission. The Avenger's shadow fell across them one last time, no longer mocked, no longer underestimated, but feared and respected as the weapon that had sealed their fate. The Atlantic was no longer a battlefield. It was an Allied highway, kept open by the persistence of a machine once ridiculed as a flying truck. The last months of the war at sea unfolded not with thunderous battles, but with a steady and unrelenting silence. By 1945, the Atlantic was no longer contested. The convoys sailed in relative safety, escorted by destroyers and shadowed overhead by Avengers, whose presence had become almost routine. What once required desperate vigilance had now become a system so effective that many sailors barely noticed how extraordinary it was. The greatest U-boat threat in history had been neutralized, not in one decisive clash, but in 1,000 daily victories delivered by persistence. In those final weeks, the Avenger's role became almost administrative: patrol, locate, destroy, repeat. It was a grim cycle, and pilots spoke later of the detachment they felt. "We were doing a job," one aviator remarked after the war, "and it was a job we had perfected. The submarines could not surprise us anymore. They could only try to survive." Survival, however, was rare. For every convoy they stalked, for every radar screen they haunted, the Avengers had already shifted the balance long before any torpedoes could be launched. April of 1945 saw a particularly symbolic encounter. A lone U-boat, attempting to intercept shipping near the British Isles, surfaced in fog. Its crew, weary and malnourished, had no illusions left. Within hours, Avengers from a nearby carrier group appeared through the mist, their engines droning overhead. The submarine attempted a crash dive, but radar and sonobuoys had already marked its position. When the depth charges detonated, witnesses recalled seeing the sea erupt in a boiling cauldron, followed by wreckage and oil slicks. For the German Navy, it was another loss in a long list that had already doomed their campaign. For the Allies, it was another tick on the tally sheet of inevitable victory. But not all encounters ended in annihilation. As surrender loomed in May, entire flotillas of U-boats were ordered to give themselves up. Avengers flew above these scenes, circling like watchful sentinels. One photograph captured a surreal moment, a column of submarines on the surface, their crews standing on deck with hands raised, while Avengers cruised silently overhead. There was no laughter anymore, no contempt for the bulky aircraft. Only resignation. The very planes once ridiculed as clumsy trucks had become the symbols of Allied control over the oceans. For the analyst, these scenes underscore the collapse of German strategy. The wolfpack concept had relied on coordination, surprise, and the vulnerability of convoys. By 1945, each of those pillars had crumbled. The Allies had broken Enigma codes, rendering coordination dangerous. Surprise was negated by radar and long-range patrols. Convoys, once fragile herds, were now ironclad fortresses shielded from above. The Avenger, with its ability to stay airborne for hours, to deploy sonobuoys, to unleash acoustic torpedoes, was not just a plane, it was the keystone of a system designed to suffocate the submarine threat. And yet, irony lingered like a bitter aftertaste. German pilots in 1942 had sneered at the Avenger, calling it slow, ungainly, and unworthy of respect. But its very slowness allowed it to loiter over the ocean for as long as needed. Its bulk gave it the room to carry experimental technologies that smaller, sleeker aircraft could not. Its apparent ungainliness concealed a deadly efficiency that only grew sharper with each passing year of the war. Every flaw mocked by the enemy had turned into an advantage when woven into the broader Allied strategy. Narrators of the post-war years often spoke with a tone of inevitability, as if the outcome had been foreseen. But the truth is that victory was built step by step, through persistence, adaptation, and the refusal to dismiss a weapon because of how it appeared. The Avenger became a symbol of this lesson. It was not glamorous, it was not beautiful, but it was devastatingly effective. And when the German Navy finally collapsed, its crews surrendering en masse, the shadow of the Avenger was part of the reason why. This is where the story folds back into the larger arc. Just as Japanese pilots once laughed at the B-29, only to be silenced by mushroom clouds, so too did German commanders mock the Avenger, only to see their proud fleet reduced to wreckage. Arrogance has a price in war, and in both oceans, that price was paid in blood and steel. The Avenger's legacy is not only its kill tally, but the lesson it left behind. Underestimating an enemy weapon because of appearances can turn a war into a disaster. As the curtain fell on the Atlantic campaign, the Avenger transitioned from weapon to memory. Veterans would tell their children and grandchildren of the aircraft that hunted silently above the waves, of the comfort it brought to convoys, of the terror it inspired in U-boat crews. The German laughter had died away in 1942, buried beneath the weight of radar pulses, sonobuoy splashes, and torpedo detonations. What remained was a sobering reminder of how quickly ridicule can turn to regret, and how a flying truck became the coffin maker of the Atlantic. The story of the TBF Avenger and the German U-boats is, at its heart, a study in arrogance. Not the loud arrogance of victory parades, but the quiet, insidious kind that whispers in officers' ears and convinces them that their enemy is laughable, that their own technology is beyond challenge, and that ridicule can substitute for analysis. The Germans, of course, were not strangers to underestimation. They had once dismissed British radar as a gimmick, American industry as clumsy, and Soviet manpower as expendable. Each of these jokes eventually came back like a knife in the dark. And with the Avenger, it was no different. When German pilots and commanders first saw the Avenger, they did not see a predator. They saw an overweight barnyard animal that happened to fly. It was slower than their Ju-88s, less elegant than their He-111s, and so bulky it seemed an insult to aerodynamics. Too slow to matter, one Luftwaffe observer supposedly remarked. The Kriegsmarine, confident in its wolfpacks, treated the plane with equal disdain. After all, submarines were terrorizing the Atlantic. What difference could a lumbering carrier-based bomber make? That was 1942. By 1945, the same men were staring up at those silhouettes with the sinking feeling of condemned prisoners watching a hangman tie the rope. The irony is brutal. The very weaknesses the Germans mocked were the strengths that undid them. Let's examine the contrasts, not in a sterile list, but in the cruel theater of cause and effect. The Avenger's slowness meant endurance. It could loiter for hours, patiently circling like a vulture while submarines gasped for air below. In war, patience kills faster than speed. The U-boats, limited by batteries, had to surface eventually. And when they did, the flying truck was waiting, heavy bomb bay doors already opening. Its bulk provided space, not just for bombs, but for the future. That cavernous fuselage carried radar sets that could pierce the fog, sonobuoys that turned the ocean into a trap, and the Fido acoustic torpedo that followed submarines like a bloodhound. The Germans laughed at its size, never realizing that size was the ticket to adaptation. A sleeker aircraft might have been glamorous, but glamour does not kill submarines. Payload does. Its awkwardness was, in truth, stability. The Avenger flew like a platform, steady and predictable, perfect for precise drops. Pilots didn't need to wrestle with the controls when lining up a depth charge pattern or releasing a torpedo. The Germans could brag about their agile fighters and nimble bombers, but underwater, agility counted for nothing against a weapon system designed to strike with patient inevitability. And then there is the wolfpack strategy itself. What was once a fearsome concept, a dozen U-boats converging on a convoy at night, firing torpedoes in coordinated chaos, had become a suicide pact by 1944. Radar made surprise impossible. Escort carriers turned convoys into moving fortresses, Avengers patrolling constantly overhead. Code-breaking rendered coordination a liability, with Enigma messages serving as invitations for ambush. The Germans clung to this doctrine long after it had become obsolete, too proud to admit that the hunter had become the prey. Here the chasm between perception and reality becomes almost comical. Imagine a German officer in 1942, puffing on a cigar, mocking the Americans for fielding an aircraft so large and clumsy it might as well have been a barn with wings. Fast forward 3 years, and that same officer is reading loss reports. U-boats destroyed before they could fire, crews surrendering without resistance, wolfpacks scattered before contact. The barn with wings had turned the Atlantic into an Allied highway, and the Kriegsmarine was reduced to a rumor of its former self. The analysts I can't help but note how predictable this downfall was. War punishes arrogance more harshly than incompetence. Incompetence makes you cautious, but arrogance blinds you. The Germans had data, losses were mounting, convoys were surviving, but their pride forced them to believe it was temporary. They assumed Allied technology was crude, that American production favored quantity over quality. What they never grasped was that, in the Avenger, the Allies had achieved both: mass production of a platform flexible enough to absorb every new invention of the anti-submarine campaign. Radar. It fit. Sonobuoys. They fit. Fido torpedoes. Perfect fit. The Avenger was not just an airplane. It was a Swiss Army knife with wings, and it was sharpened year by year until nothing escaped. Contrast this with the Germans' own innovations. The snorkel, meant to allow submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, arrived too late and often broke down. The Type XXI, a true submarine with extended underwater speed, was an engineering marvel that came in 1945 when the war was already lost. These designs were impressive in theory, but they were answers to questions asked 3 years too late. The Allies, by then, had built not just machines but a complete ecosystem of detection, tracking, and destruction. In such an ecosystem, the Avenger was the predator at the top of the food chain. The bitterest pill for the Germans was that they had seen this coming but refused to admit it. Reports from the front warned of increasing losses. Survivors whispered of aircraft that never left us alone. Yet the command structure, drunk on past victories, treated these warnings as exaggerations. Pride told them the U-boat was still the ace card. By the time reality sank in, so did the submarines. So let us put it plainly. The Germans did not lose the Battle of the Atlantic because the Avenger was miraculous. They lost because they laughed. They laughed at the wrong weapon, dismissed the wrong machine, and sneered at the wrong silhouette. In doing so, they handed their enemy the psychological high ground. While the Allies refined and deployed the Avenger into a lethal system, the Germans clung to their contempt, as if ridicule could shield a submarine from radar pulses or chase away an acoustic torpedo. History has a cruel sense of humor. The very arrogance that made the Avenger a punchline in 1942 turned into the epitaph of the U-boat fleet in 1945. If the Germans had treated the aircraft seriously from the start, they might have accelerated their countermeasures, altered their strategy, or at least avoided such catastrophic losses. But they chose mockery. And in war, mockery is a luxury bought with lives. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the Atlantic was no longer a battlefield. It was an Allied highway, stretching unbroken from the harbors of North America to the battered ports of Britain. Tankers, troopships, and freighters sailed in convoys that seemed untouchable, protected not just by destroyers but by the invisible umbrella cast by Avengers circling far above. What had once been the most dangerous gauntlet of the war had become routine, and that transformation carried consequences that shaped the decades to come. The most immediate consequence was logistical. Without control of the Atlantic, the Allies could never have launched the Normandy invasion. Every tank, every shell, every ration for the D-Day armies crossed that ocean. And every crossing owed its safety, in part, to the flying trucks that kept U-boats submerged, scattered, and destroyed. General Eisenhower himself later admitted that victory in Europe would have been impossible had the U-boats maintained their dominance. The Battle of the Atlantic, he said, was the first battle we had to win. And it was the Avengers, among others, who made that victory possible. For the sailors and airmen who lived it, the psychological consequences were profound. Merchant seamen who once signed on for voyages with fatalistic dread now found themselves sailing with cautious optimism. Diaries recovered from those convoys reveal a recurring theme: relief at the sight of Avengers overhead. One entry from a British seaman in late 1944 reads, "We no longer pray for luck alone. We pray for the sound of engines above us. When they come, we know we are not forgotten." That sound, the steady drone of an aircraft once ridiculed, became synonymous with survival. On the German side, the effect was the opposite. U-boat crews, once lionized as the gray wolves of the Atlantic, were reduced to exhausted, fearful men who dreaded the daylight. Their own logs capture the transformation. One commander wrote in January 1945, "The planes wait always. We cannot surface without fear. Even the night is no longer ours." This despair seeped through the entire fleet, eroding morale faster than Allied bombs could erode steel. 4 young recruits shoved into submarines in the final months of the war, the Avenger was not a joke but a nightmare, an inevitable hunter that shadowed every dive, every surface, every desperate dash toward safety. The long-term consequences extended far beyond the war. In the years that followed, naval doctrine across the world was rewritten with one principle carved in stone: never underestimate the power of air over sea. The Avenger was not the only proof, but it was one of the most convincing. It demonstrated that an aircraft need not be fast or glamorous to dominate a theater. What mattered was range, endurance, and the ability to carry new technologies as they emerged. These lessons shaped post-war designs of patrol aircraft like the P-2 Neptune and the P-3 Orion, machines that echoed the Avenger's philosophy of persistence over elegance. The psychological impact also carried into the Cold War. Submarines remained a strategic weapon, now armed with nuclear warheads, but the memory of the Atlantic campaign haunted both sides. NATO invested heavily in maritime patrol aircraft, radar networks, and sonar systems, all built on the model pioneered in the Avenger's time. The Soviets, learning from Germany's bitter experience, designed their submarines with greater underwater endurance, higher speeds, and quieter engines, direct responses to the vulnerabilities that had doomed the U-boats. In this way, every shadow of an Avenger in 1944 cast a longer shadow across the decades that followed. But perhaps the deepest legacy lies in the cautionary tale of arrogance. The Germans had not lost because the Avenger was flawless. They lost because they laughed. They dismissed the aircraft before understanding it, ridiculed its weaknesses while ignoring its adaptability, and doubled down on obsolete tactics when evidence of failure mounted all around them. The story became a textbook case taught in war colleges. Never allow contempt to blind analysis. As one naval historian dryly observed, the U-boats drowned in the ocean of their own overconfidence. The Avenger itself became an icon, though a quiet one. Unlike the Spitfire or the Mustang, it did not adorn posters or inspire romantic tales of dogfights. Its legacy was more somber, more functional, but no less vital. Museums displayed its hulking frame, veterans told stories of its steady protection, and the men who flew it remembered the strange satisfaction of knowing they had turned ridicule into victory. To them, the aircraft symbolized a truth often ignored in war. It is not beauty, but persistence, that wins. Reporters in the years after the war often sought out the men who had once mocked the Avenger. Few spoke openly, but captured German documents tell their own story. Reports sent back to Berlin in 1943 and 1944 described the aircraft with growing respect. By 1945, the language had changed entirely. The American torpedo bomber is to be considered one of the greatest threats to U-boat operations. The laughter of 1942 had been replaced by formal acknowledgments of terror. History, it seems, has a sharp sense of irony. Even in popular memory, the Avenger carries a strange duality. In America, it is remembered partly because a young naval aviator named George H.W. Bush flew one and was shot down in 1944. His story gave the aircraft a human face, linking it to future history. But among those who sailed the convoys, its reputation was different. It was the quiet guardian that kept them alive. To the Germans, it was the angel of death. Rarely has a single machine inspired such divergent emotions, depending on which side of the ocean you stood. In the final measure, the Avenger's long-term impact was less about the number of submarines it sank than about the certainty it created. By existing, by flying, by circling above convoys hour after hour, it denied the enemy freedom of action. It turned the open ocean into a trap, not through drama, but through inevitability. That inevitability became the model for future maritime strategy. And the laughter that once greeted the Avenger serves as a warning still relevant today. Dismiss no weapon too quickly, for war has a way of turning the absurd into the decisive. Thus, the Avenger's true victory lies not just in the wrecks it left behind, but in the lessons it carved into military memory. Arrogance drowns. Patience kills. And sometimes, the clumsiest shadow in the sky is the one you should fear most. History has an unforgiving way of punishing arrogance. In 1942, the German Navy and Luftwaffe pilots laughed at the TBF Avenger. They called it slow, clumsy, and unworthy of serious concern. To them, it was just a flying truck, an awkward machine unlikely to alter the tides of war. Yet by 1945, that same truck had crushed the backbone of the U-boat fleet, transforming the Atlantic from a graveyard for Allied shipping into a lifeline of victory. The mockery of yesterday had become the nightmare of today. The lesson is clear, and it resonates far beyond the Second World War. Never underestimate an enemy weapon. Never assume that size, shape, or first impressions define effectiveness. War is not won by appearances, but by persistence, adaptability, and integration. The Avenger was not a masterpiece of design in the aesthetic sense. It did not win hearts with elegance, but it won battles with range, payload, and the ability to absorb new technology. Where the Germans saw flaws, the Allies saw potential. And in that difference lay the fate of the Atlantic. There is a bitter irony in how ridicule became ruin. Had the Germans treated the Avenger seriously from the beginning, they might have accelerated countermeasures or revised doctrine before the balance shifted irreversibly. Instead, arrogance blinded them, and contempt deafened them. The laughter of 1942 echoed into the silence of 1945, when U-boats surrendered en masse under the shadow of the very planes once mocked. It is a reminder that arrogance kills as surely as any weapon. For those who flew and those who sailed beneath its protection, the Avenger became more than an aircraft. It was a guardian. Its steady drone overhead meant convoys would reach their destinations, families would be fed, soldiers would be armed, and victory would remain possible. For the U-boat crews, that same drone meant dread, exhaustion, and the knowledge that their time was measured in hours. A single silhouette in the sky carried two truths: survival for one side, destruction for the other. Looking back, the Avenger's legacy is not just technical but philosophical. It proved that adaptability outlives elegance, that persistence outpaces speed, that ridicule is the most dangerous weapon you can hand to your enemy, for it blinds you to the reality that is unfolding. The Germans gave in to that blindness, and it cost them the Atlantic. And as we close this chapter, I want to remind you, the story you've just heard is more than history. It is a mirror. It shows us how arrogance, contempt, and misplaced confidence can destroy even the strongest fleets. It warns us to look beyond appearances, to respect even the humblest weapon, and to remember that in war, underestimation is suicide. If you found this story compelling, if you believe more people should hear how laughter turned into lament, and how a so-called flying truck became one of the deadliest hunters of World War II, then don't let it end here. Hit the like button to tell the algorithm this history matters. Share it so others can witness the irony that shaped the Atlantic. And subscribe to this channel, because we are not done. More forgotten battles, more untold weapons, more voices from the past await. Together, we'll uncover the lessons war tried to bury. Because history doesn't just belong in textbooks, it belongs in stories, in voices, in the reminders that arrogance has consequences. And as long as these stories are told, the laughter that once mocked the Avenger will never drown out the truth, that persistence, patience, and respect for the enemy win wars. The TBF Avenger may never have been beautiful, but it was decisive. And in the end, that mattered far more than beauty ever could.